Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Open Classroom. I'm Janet Gillow, Director of Professional Development for the Brown School, and I am so pleased to have you with us for today's program. Throughout the program, you are muted. You can please interact with us, though, through the chat feature. This program is being recorded, so if you want to grab a copy later, if you need to leave us, please visit the Brown School's YouTube channel, and within a few hours, a copy of this will be available. I want to acknowledge my co-host and friend, Cynthia Williams, our Assistant Dean for Community Partnerships. She's with us, and she's going to be in the chat, helping to field your questions, and then as the presentation comes closer to the end, she'll be representing your voice in this room. So before we get started, I want to share some of the other things that are coming up. We'll be back on at 3 p.m. Central for a presentation that we're doing in partnership with the iChad Center on HIV prevention in Uganda. We have Dr. John Santelli from Columbia University joining us. And then next week, Open Classroom and the Brown School are partnering with other universities across the country for a national teach-in on systemic racism. We were invited to participate in that by our colleagues at Salem State University. So on Tuesday next week, 12:30, we have a program, George Floyd in Context, a historical perspective on racial violence in the U.S. That talk is being delivered by Dr. Mike Pfeiffer, who's with John Jay College, City University of New York. And on Wednesday next week, so a week from tomorrow, at 11 a.m., we're partnering with the American Academy on Social Work and Social Welfare for a conversation on systemic racism and poverty. And that conversation is going to feature Larry Davis with the University of Pittsburgh, Michael Lindsay with New York University, and the Brown School's own Mark Rank. So did you see what happened there? Partnership or collaboration between the Brown School and 5 institutions that are not even in our time zone. Our lives have changed. There are things that we're missing and also wonderful possibilities. And we're just so glad that you are a part of what we're doing today. So our guest today is Stephen Harowitz. He's the Executive Director of Campfire, which is an organization that teaches storytelling and public speaking. And as a presenter for professional development, Stephen leads workshops for us on these topics and also has taught in our Summer Institute. I'm hoping to twist his arm and bring him back in 2021. But here to guide us through 5 tips for virtual facilitation, please welcome my friend, Stephen Harowitz.
Yay, thanks, Janet. Thanks, Cynthia. And thanks, everybody, for taking part in this Open Classroom. I'm really excited to talk to you about virtual facilitation because it is a topic that a lot of us, most of us, are having to think about as we move to a virtual space. I'm going to do a screen share, and you'll see my desktop first, and then I'm going to put the deck up, so give it just a second before it kicks in. And there we go. Let's shift that around just a little bit. Let's do a different one because that's a different desktop. I have 3 monitors, which makes my life way easier, but at the same time is going to always be a little challenging because I have 3 monitors and each one of them is its own separate input. All right, is that showing up for you, Janet? All right. So we're going to talk about 5 tips for effective virtual facilitation today. There are a bunch more that we could talk through, but I wanted to focus as much as I could on the 5 that I have found to be most useful. And I tried to also elicit some of these from the trainers and faculty that help teach the classes and host some of the facilitated spaces that Campfire hosts. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about myself. While I do that, I'm going to lean on my friends Janet and Cynthia to open up a poll. There's going to be 2 pieces that we're going to be asking about. One of which is, what types of meetings do you facilitate? And also we're going to ask a little bit about how many meetings per month do you facilitate? These are going to help me get a sense of who's in the room and also what types of spaces that you're in. So while you're responding, I'll tell you just a little bit about myself. So I started Campfire, 4+ years ago, and have been leading the organization ever since, and our team has slowly grown over time. And my facilitation experience extends far in front of that. So this is kind of a culmination in a lot of ways of holding space and facilitating conversation amongst groups. I also got to use ambient video, which I told Janet about this time. So if there's no audio on that video, it's intentional because I got to actually use like background video of myself, which is kind of fun. The other thing that I also like to name is that I'm an improviser. So a show that I've been producing for the last 6 years is a show called Front Runner, and it's an improvised political debate we bring back every election cycle to promote civic engagement and voter registration. And so we're in the middle of that right now. This is a show from 6 years ago, maybe. And this is a big part of my work as a facilitator, is being able to be quick on my feet and improvise. And then the other piece that I'll name, and I've never used this picture in any presentation I've ever done. This is me when I was 17. I was an event DJ. I think I was working a 12-year-old birthday party. I've had a lot of odd jobs in my career, and I try to lean on a little bit of all of them in how I facilitate. So I'm an amalgamation of a lot of different things, and hopefully some of that will come through as we talk about these tips. I'll also talk just a bit about what Campfire is. So to Janet's point, we really focus on a couple main areas, but at the core of it, we're a group of teachers and practitioners of storytelling, group facilitation, and public speaking. And something else that we've figured out is, while those are the areas that we focus on, our work tends to boil down into reminding folks how powerful their voices are and to make space for those voices to be heard. That at the end of the day, folks have all of these skill sets and talents, and sometimes it's just about the confidence to speak up and to speak out. And that tends to be a lot of the work that we do, and we're really lucky to do that work in both our public classes on storytelling or any of the facilitation work we do for nonprofit organizations. Let's get into the core of this. So we've got our 5 tips here. So let's take a look. And Janet, can I ask you a quick question? Are you seeing my current slide screen, or are you seeing just the slides themselves?
I see 5 tips. I just launched the share poll results so that folks could see where they stand in the group, and you could get to know kind of where everybody's coming from.
Do you see those poll results now on screen?
I do. Can you see them?
Yeah, that's great. I've never tried that before. We're adding that one on the fly. So
Allie is seeing just slides and no notes, and okay. I just see 5 tips. So let me know when we want to get the poll results off the screen.
Let's grab those real quick. I think we're good on the poll results. I feel good about that. And I'm looking at those real quick, and it looks like the majority are facilitating staff or team meetings. The number 1 is educational classes or trainings, which is great because that's a space that I exist in quite frequently. We've got some retreats, folks, even though it's only 8%, but hooray for retreats, another favorite. Let's look about how many meetings per month. We've got 4 or fewer coming in at 41% and 5 to 10 at 41%. So people are really doing the work, which is great. This is a really good group then to have this conversation with. It's a nice blend. So thanks for submitting those responses, and thanks Janet and Cynthia for getting those up as well. So let's talk about these tips. The first thing that I want to name about virtual facilitation is that it feels very much like the wild, wild west of facilitation right now. There is a ton of new tools that are coming out, what feels like every day. There's a lot of new methodologies, a lot of people who are taking very traditional structures and agendas and changing really the core of how they're done to fit virtual. So even for me, it's sometimes hard to keep up with them. It makes a lot of decisions needing to be made. And with the tips that we're going to talk about, I'm really hopeful that I'm going to give you some of the philosophical thinking behind it, but also some particularly tangible tools and techniques that you can use now in your work. So giving you hopefully just a little bit about both of those. The other thing I want to name before I start showing these tips is that I'm speaking from a mindset of using Zoom, just because there's a ton of tools out there, Microsoft Teams, WebEx, can't talk about all of those, but a lot of these tips are going to be able to translate across really any of those tools. So that should help, but just know that I'm speaking a little bit with Zoom in mind on this. So let's talk about what these tips are. So we've got 5, and I'm not going to read through all of them because we're going to dig into each. But the first one that I think is important to lean into, as it says, is leaning into the good of virtual. I know one of the conversations that I had the most when everything shifted online is folks who were maybe pessimistic is the right word on virtual as a high level tool to facilitate with. And I totally understand where that was coming from, because there's a lot of challenges that comes along with it. But really the thing that I feel like I always end up saying is there's so many opportunities in what you can do in virtual spaces. So many opportunities. When I was teaching the last Summer Institute course, one of the activities that we did was barriers, challenges, and benefits. And what I asked the class on, it was on virtual facilitation through the Brown School. What I asked them was, what are you seeing as barriers? Meaning, what's keeping people from being able to join virtual spaces? And then the challenges of that. So once they're in a meeting or a Zoom space, what challenges are you confronting to see full participation? And then the last being, what are those benefits? And I just want to highlight a few of these because I think they're really apt. A big one that was named was tech literacy. Another big one was internet accessibility. And not only that, but let's say you have access to the internet, but your internet or Wi-Fi is spotty at best, knowing in Zoom that moment when all of a sudden you have freeze framed in a very odd position or in a, like with your eyes closed. And then also hardware and software issues. If you don't have a newer computer or maybe the tools that you would be using to join these kind of spaces just have issues, that's going to keep you from being able to step into that. Another one that comes up a lot is around additional support for participating groups. If you have things going on at home that you're having to take care of, that can both be a challenge, but also a pretty big barrier for you to step into some of those conversations. So keeping a participant's viewpoint, recognizing these barriers is going to help you better plan. Some of the challenges, once you have participants in your meeting spaces, talking about lots of interruption and over talking in large groups. That happens all the time. People unmuting, trying to speak up, that awkward back and forth, not quite sure how to engage or when you can engage. Also for folks managing between multiple screens or sounds or notifications, that when we're in virtual spaces, it's so much easier to click around into browser windows or into other things and getting lost in all of those. And then something I think that also needs to be noticed is people being intimidated by the change, that if a tech space is not necessarily their most natural space, then are they going to be able to fully engage if they're intimidated by it? So the students did a really great job naming these. And then some of the benefits, and this is where I want to challenge folks to lean into, is things like improved accessibility. I was in a webinar through the Colorado Trust not too long ago. They were talking about a cohort that they run. And while the cohort members were presenting, they were using Zoom's translation feature. So I could listen in to live translation into Spanish, into French, from people who are not in that state even. And so it was opening up all these windows of opportunity for people to have access to the content. And not just that, but access to just the meeting in general, that you can come from anywhere and take part in this, which gets to the point of you can get more people involved. It's also giving you access to creative tools like Mural, which we'll talk a little bit, a digital whiteboard tool that people can have more access to than you would in a traditional space. And then one that we're seeing right now is it's easier to capture the work. Right now we're recording, we're live streaming. If this was in a room in the Brown School, that's still a possibility. It would just take more extra work and effort. But this time Janet got to hit a button and we've started recording and streaming, which again opens up access to some of the content and makes it more available to folks. All of those things are great. Lean into those. Where can you find the advantages and what does the tool give you? So really understanding the tools that you're using to pull people together, to convene people, what can they do additionally to help you out? It's important to put a little bit of like guardrails on that tip too. So 3 limits that I keep in mind when I'm designing a virtual facilitation, which is participants' abilities. And so we've talked about accessibility, but let's also name the fact that sometimes participants have to join via phone. Sometimes they have to join via iPad. And so the access that they might need to an additional tool or even something like a Word document to do an activity, that might be challenging. So when we talk about abilities in a physical space, we might be asking questions like, do folks have any food restrictions if we're going to be providing lunch, or are there any accessibility questions about getting into the building? But for something like this, are we needing to ask questions like, what type of computer do you have? Do you have reliable Wi-Fi access? Do you have a space in your home that you can be really focused in? Those are the types of questions that are just different for virtual spaces, and making sure that when you're designing an agenda that you're focusing on participants' abilities and not leaving anyone out or behind. Same thing with readiness. Are people in your space ready to engage in a new topic, in a new tool? Without thinking about those things, sometimes we can design agendas that are really facilitator focused or what we want to accomplish, and sometimes can leave out the voices that most need to be centered, which are those of the participants. The third limit on this is the next tip, which is a rule of thumb that we've really leaned into, which is using a max of 2 tools at a time. I was in a workshop, this was in February, March, as things were really starting to shift. And the whole workshop was about virtual facilitation. And I remember, and I like to think I'm pretty fluid and good at some of these spaces. I remember they were introducing 4 brand new tools. It was a one day long workshop, and I was so overwhelmed, and I was missing content, and I was really frustrated. I was trying to chat with the organizers. I think there was 3 folks, and I wasn't getting responses because so many people at the same time were all having the same issue. And so we've started from Campfire, we started focusing on try to only use a max of 2 tools at a time. Because if we're thinking about Zoom, even Zoom has multiple tools even in and of itself. It's not just the video conferencing, there's chat, there's polls, there's all kinds of stuff even in that. So to make folks feel a little more comfortable and that they can engage, try not to overwhelm or overload them. And I'll show you the tools that we use, and it's gonna be a list. And I'm not saying we use them all at the same time because that would go against this tip. But these are just the ones that we do use. So we obviously use Zoom. That's our main way of facilitating conversation. We also use Mural, which is an example here off to the side I'll talk about in a moment. We use Google Drive and apps because it's a way that I can give folks who maybe might not have Microsoft Word access to a document editing tool or an Excel type tool, and I can share those links pretty easily over chat. We also use Basecamp for our internal communications and project management. We'll do group text amongst instructors or facilitators as a back channel, because that's also a pretty commonly used way to communicate in general. And then also a new tool that we're adding in is Mentimeter, which I don't know as much about, but my faculty are super excited about because it's a polling tool that they found really easy, that they like a lot. The Mural board that you're looking at here, so Mural is a digital whiteboard, and there's a couple other options. So maybe you've heard of Miro, M-I-R-O, or Google Jamboard, which is another free option. We really like Mural because it's powerful, but it's simple. And the board that you're looking at here, just as an example of that, is from the Summer Institute course on virtual facilitation. And what we did is at the end of the class, the students had an open space, kind of an unconference type of space, to name the topics that they really wanted to talk about. And so everybody had access to Mural. They don't have to have memberships. It can be guest access. So all I had to do was drop a link in the chat for them. And they all went in and added topics that they wanted to talk about. And then we had dot voting. So you can see those blue dots, and they voted on the topics that they wanted to talk about. And as they lifted to the top on that side section where it says step 2 room selection, they dropped little digital nameplates into the rooms. And then I put them in breakout rooms for them to have those conversations. And then they added takeaways at the bottom. It's really engaging. It gives people more agency over their ability to engage. Thinking similar, like with a Google Doc, everybody adding notes to it. This is just a different way to graphically represent that and to give people an opportunity to engage a little bit more. I'll show one more example. This one took a little while to figure out, but I think it is a good example of that first tip too, of leaning into the good of virtual. So this board is a fake room layout. We were trying to design a simulation activity for a group. And in a physical space, you could get up and you could walk around, you can move room to room. That's not as possible in a digital space. And so every room on this fake layout is a different Zoom room. So you can kind of see a little red box there. It's a Zoom link. And so each group was put into a different room, and they could move freely from room to room to engage and collaborate with one another, all within and under this umbrella of they're part of a 2030 Presidential Blue Ribbon Commission on Health Advocacy, and they have to design the future of the health advocacy field. And so we use Mural as a way to design a physical space in a virtual space. And again, anybody could take part because nobody had to pay for their own memberships. They could be guests inside of this. So we created a central spot for it. I'll give you 2 little inside peeks too on this. So Mural has a consultants network you can apply for, and you can get free licenses. So if that's something you're thinking about, if you do a lot of facilitation work, maybe you have a strapped budget, they do have this really cool network you can join, and they'll give you free access to a lot of powerful tools inside of Mural. Similarly with Basecamp, if you're interested in some project management or internal communications tool, they have a free offering. They have a cap on projects, but you can get a free license to that as well, which is really, really great as well. Let's keep moving along. We've got tip number 3. So thinking of your agenda as choreography. Something that we learned from feedback with our students was they really appreciated how fluid and smooth the online classes we were teaching were. Part of that was because we put a lot of time and effort into agenda design and also being really explicit with how each session is going to go, where maybe in a physical space, we might not put quite as much detail to it. Now we're really, we're getting granular into some of these places because I'm sure folks on this call have seen this, but those awkward pauses or the weird moments when a facilitator or someone leading a meeting is trying to also take notes and they're also trying to post things in the chat and they're also trying to share screen. It's just a lot. It's a lot to manage. And so we are designing now in basically 2 parallels, one being the facilitator and making sure that they have as much room to be connected to participants as possible. And at the same time, there's something going on in the behind the scenes to smooth out those transition points. I want to show you an agenda that we use just to kind of point this out a little bit. So for our agendas, we are creating an arc. So we use a story arc, the same one that we teach students, to create a flow for our entire agenda. And we're color coding each part of the agenda. I want to be able to glance at this and keep going. As much as I can as a facilitator, keep my participants centered in my viewpoint, and I'm paying most attention to them, is I want to be able to just quickly look at my agenda and to move on. And I want the same thing for anybody who's going to act as a teaching assistant or a volunteer, because maybe you're thinking, well, I'm the only one who's leading these meetings. If there are folks in that room with you, it is perfectly fair to ask for a volunteer and to say, hey, I'm going to share this agenda with you, and anything that's in purple, could you just post that in the chat when I ask you to? It's on page da-da-da. And that way you're not having to do the looking for the file or clicking into that tab and copying the text into the chat, but you're asking for help and assistance to smooth out the overall experience. And also trying to be as explicit as you possibly can with those instructions. So if you look at that agenda, you'll see that we're really writing out almost, not quite scripting it. We're not quite at that point, but we're getting pretty close because I want to make sure that I'm using the right language, because if I'm trying to explain to a participant about changing from gallery view to speaker view, I want to call it that thing because that's on their screen. That's what they're seeing themselves. And so I don't want to add any more confusion. So we're getting really explicit in those directions to participants. Our agendas can be a little, I would say, robust, maybe overwhelming to some, depending on who we're sharing it with. At the same time, we know that doing it this way has really upped our game in making a participant's experience better and smoother, because I want a participant to walk out knowing that not only are we espousing these views or beliefs on facilitation, especially we're doing a training on facilitation, but we're living up to that practice. So I want to put forward the best foot to do that. And the way that we do that is at the very beginning is making a really strong agenda to have that choreography of back and forth between tech and in person, because I can't just get up and go over to the whiteboard and start writing and drawing. I need to have something to be able to do that and to do that well. So it's as smooth as possible. Let's shift into the next tip. So setting precedents and sticking to them. One of the clearest examples that I can think about as to why this is important is I was co-facilitating a cohort, and we were all in a big group, and then we split out into breakout groups, into 4 breakout groups. And in that breakout group, I said, all right, we're going to use the chat as a speakers list. So if you want to speak, add your name to the speakers list, and I'll call one by one. And that worked pretty well for our group. It was smooth flowing. And then we came back to the larger group, and that precedent was not set with any of the other breakout rooms. And so my poor group, I felt so bad for them, were adding their names into the chat because they wanted to talk, but the conversation kept going past them because nobody else did that. And so now everybody's just kind of like talking, and my group's like, my name's in the chat. Why isn't anyone calling on me? It was because I set a precedent that nobody else had been, it hasn't been set for anybody else. And so when I'm facilitating, I'm really trying to be as conscientious as possible. What culture or what behavior are we trying to deploy so that our conversations can move both fluidly and efficiently, but also to the place that we're trying to go, that we're actually getting to the objectives that we're trying to get to. And so we've been really explicit in our agendas and then in our spaces is what precedent are we setting and how people can engage? Because virtual spaces can be awkward enough in their own right, but to set some ground rules, not just in words, but in behavior, can go a really long way to get people where you want them to go. So I want to kind of point out a couple of the precedents that we use. We always use a waiting room. That's for security purposes, but also because then we can bring people in groups, in small groups. And it doesn't feel like, if someone who joins like 10 minutes beforehand, that it's just them and the instructor kind of like sitting there looking at each other. We'll try to have conversations, obviously, but the waiting room is a really nice feature to do bulk admittance in a way that feels more natural. And once we bring people in, part of using that waiting room is that we do audio checks. So we want to hear people's voice. Let's get people comfortable with speaking up. So we ask individually for folks to unmute and just do an audio check. Hey, can you hear us? They'll say something, we can hear you, and then they can mute again. But it's just getting in a behavior of speaking up a little bit in a way that feels structured so that when it's less structured later, they can engage and feel good about engaging. We also are trying to remind folks to turn off self-view if they so choose. I really love this analogy that a trainer told me about. And he was like, with Zoom, if your self-view's on, it's hard not to look at yourself. I have a little box with my face in the top right corner. It's really hard not to just like stare at that, at any given point in this. I have to like keep looking back. For participants, what is it doing to them to have a picture of themselves up the whole time? And his analogy was basically like, it'd be like if you went into a meeting room in a physical space and brought a mirror with you and just watched yourself the whole time. And what does that do? And so we just try to make a reminder to folks, hey, it's challenge by choice. If you want, turn off your self-view, see how it feels, because it really does. It makes a difference. There's a different feeling to being in a space. We also start with happies and crappies. So if like roses and thorn buds or any of those check-ins, it's a nice way to get people talking, kind of like that audio check. And so we do it in every single space. And so they know that this is part of it. And so a crappy being, what's something not so great that happened since the last time we saw you? What's something really great that happened since the last time we saw you? And we try to support and clap for that to, again, encourage people to speak up. Because again, it's building those muscles up for engagement as people go along. Using the chat as a speakers list is another big precedent. I mentioned this before. This maybe is one of the biggest successes when it comes to a virtual methodology that I use, especially if we're trying to keep in mind that obviously we've got a mixture typically of introverts and extroverts, that instead of having folks do the rolling the dice on unmuting and speaking up, usually right when somebody else is about to, and then it not going well, add your name to the speakers list. Then it's in your control, or then when you're going to be speaking next, when I'm going to call on you, because it's there, it's listed, and I'm going by that order. And so it creates a little bit of structure. And especially if it's with an early on group, then I can start to build up some, I wouldn't say it's not awareness, it's just like, it's confidence that they can speak up and be heard. And so using that chat as a speakers list has been really, really useful to get people talking, to get people engaged in a space that it can be sometimes really hard to do that. And then the last precedent that we use is putting a countdown on screen during breaks. So you've seen this little screenshot I've got over here from one of my tabs. If you Google the word timer, it'll give you a timer, a really simple one. You can set it for whatever time. And you can also make it full screen. And so anytime we have a break, which we try to do often, we'll put up a timer. And that way there's 2 minutes and 30 seconds left before we come back from break. We obviously tell people, all right, it's 1 o'clock now, we'll be back in 10 minutes, 1:10. but there's something different about having a timer because you really know down to the second when it's time to turn your video back on. So we're trying to maximize this time and be really clear with folks about how much time that they do have for themselves. And because you can Google that word, it's really simple to use and to pull up along the way. So we try to set these precedents at the top. And especially with groups that we see week to week, month to month, if we keep doing this, it becomes more natural and more organic, and we build up that culture and behavior as a group. And that's going to make my job as a facilitator so much easier as we move along in a space like virtual. The last tip, and then we have some time for Q&A, and hopefully I can get really specific to maybe to some questions you have, because I was able to read a little bit through the chat and through the poll about what kind of spaces folks are facilitating. The last one that I'll talk about is making space for people's humanness. You are watching me right now in the basement of my home. This is not real. This is a green screen, and right behind it is the AC unit and the winter coats. And over here, let's see, I'm gonna see if I can actually do this without breaking everything. There's Ruby, the dog, sleeping on the floor. And so you're in my home, and that is very different than when we weren't so physically distanced. It is a huge opportunity to better get to know the people that you are facilitating or working with. And you will be richer for doing it by making that space. And so what I'm talking by that is normalizing the average at-home experience. So this is a picture of one of those examples. The dog on top is Rye, the dog on bottom is Fizz. We've had many, many times where I'm facilitating a space and dogs make friends, cats make friends. One of my favorites is when a cat jumps up behind somebody on somebody's shoulder. I've had participants' kids become friends over break. One time we had two kids see each other, and then at break, their parents brought them back into the camera and let them just connect and chat while we were on break, and they became friends. It's a really cool thing when you can do that. And that's not always the case, and not everybody's going to be 100% comfortable with it. But if I see somebody in the background, somebody's loved one, trying to awkwardly get out of camera, I'll ask very kindly, hey, can we meet that person? And sometimes they'll bring them in, we'll say hi. And it just creates a more richer group experience over time. And it's less awkward for the participant too. They can feel like they can bring a full self into it because they're home, just like you're in mine right now. Another way to do this is to give people more time. Right now, when I'm designing agendas, even if I think a section is only going to take 2 minutes, I'm going to build in 5 minutes. Finding buttons, clicking through windows, typing something up, especially if it's an activity, that stuff takes time in person, and it also takes time virtually, sometimes even more so. That was one of the things an instructor of mine kept telling me is, I'm surprised how much longer it's taking to get things done versus when it was in person. So give people more time. I'll add an asterisk myself onto that is give people more time too so people can connect. I'm starting to build buffer into agendas. I'm pretty, if you could tell from that agenda example, I want to hit the beats, but I'm putting in more time so people can connect too, that if people want to have some side conversations or to just converse, great. That'll make the meetings and the rooms that I hold more looked forward to by people because they know that they can still chat and connect, because that's just not always going to be the case right now. Also offering stretch and eye breaks. So doing stretch breaks, either led by myself or sometimes I'll ask participants to lead them. Those are super fun. Part of my improv world is made up stretches. So there's a whole improv warm up around made up yoga, and you can make up the name for it and do all kinds of fun stuff. That's a really fun one to offer to folks on a rotating basis too, is let people make up a stretch and give your body a little bit of some movement. Eye breaks was something that I tried actually with the Summer Institute class for the first time. I wasn't sure I would go. They really liked it. We said, turn off your camera and just close your eyes for a minute and just give your eyes a break, especially towards the end of the day, if you've been on meetings all day. It shows a certain level of care, not just that you're getting the objectives on your agenda done, but more broadly. One place too is when I have issues with somebody as far as tech, I always try to pull them into a breakout room if I've got the time to work through that, because there's nothing like trying to work through a tech issue in front of a whole bunch of people. And so I just try to step out into a breakout room, let the group talk amongst themselves, and then I can work with that person one-on-one and work through that tech issue. And if Zoom is the problem that they're having, I give out my cell phone number at the very top and just say, hey, if you've got an issue and you can't even engage in Zoom, just text me and I'll jump on a phone call and I'll mute myself and make sure that you're there. I want to make sure that it's okay if there's having issues, because I want everybody to fully participate. And that last piece, again, is just reminding folks that they can turn off their self view and make it a little bit easier for them to engage and not to be looking at themselves the whole time. There's a couple last little pieces I just want to speak to. We're having a pre-conversation as people were rolling in, and Cynthia asked this really great question about how do we draw energy from a group when we're not in the same room. And I love that question because it is a challenge and it is different. And what I think about a lot is inside of these boxes, is there ways to feel that energy as much as possible, whether we use clapping like with ASL, or if we have folks dropping into chat, feeling words, one-word check-ins, things like that. And somebody can be the voice and hype the group a little bit more because it is different. So how do we lean into the parts of Zoom or the parts of our video conferencing tool that let people's voices be heard without having to have everybody be unmuted? And for you as the facilitator to harness that and to hopefully focus that in and let the rest of the group know how everybody's feeling. You're kind of that top level view, which I love that question. I think it's great. All right, I'm gonna pause there. I know that Janet, we had talked about maybe doing a chat question, like what tip would you add to the list? Could we maybe drop that in the chat?
We already did, and we got some great responses.
All right.
I missed your first cue, but I got your second one.
Nailing it, we're there.
So Shelley mentioned that they recently had a training where calming music was played while people were logging on and setting up. It was really nice and they had good feedback. I think Atia had a similar suggestion that you can set the tone with music. Mm-hmm. Susan says they always have a slide that has basic Zoom instructions, etiquette, and they ask participants to put their names and pronouns in the chat. It's a great idea. Michael said he's found the Q&A feature allows attendees to dialogue with presenters who are not presenting in real time and allows more questions to get answered in the course of a workshop. Okay, and Mimi shares that there can be a potential issue with sharing personal backgrounds in terms of socioeconomic disparities, and just something to be considering as you craft the experience.
Absolutely. Jana, I'm going to stop my share too, just so pull that down.
Great. And Elizabeth is sharing that they start with a breathing exercise to get everybody centered, and then do a land acknowledgement and share the rules of communication for the workshop. Mm-hmm. Michael pointing out that virtual backgrounds, oh, I'm sorry. So this is actually, I'm going to pause that because we're going to pivot to questions in just a second.
Okay, Stephen, there's a question coming from the beginning of your presentation from Mimi, I believe. She asked, how exactly do you feel that this virtual platform supports extroverts and introverts? Can you expand on that?
Yeah. I think some of the challenges in virtual spaces can be similar to in-person spaces, that there are participants who will take up a lot of space, not by any malice, that just they want to speak up, they have thoughts, they feel really comfortable speaking out. And then sometimes in those spaces, you have folks who it will just take a little bit longer or need a little bit more encouragement to get there. I think in a virtual space, especially with using the chat as a speakers list, I tend to count to 10 in my head in general once I've asked a question to get and give people time to think through a question. And the speakers list kind of does that, where you might get a first wave of participants who drop their names in immediately, but over time you'll get a little bit more of those extroverts or introverts who will then add into the conversation. So I think that's one way to take care of it. I also think taking those breaks, eye breaks, actual breaks, stretch breaks, can help folks who being on camera can be really exhausting for folks. That in and of itself too can be really nice. Depending on abilities in the space and being cognizant of those, we'll use hands as a way to engage as well. So if you're an introvert and you don't want to speak up, maybe a thumb scale. How you feeling right now about this? Thumbs up, great. Thumbs down, not so great, is a good way to get voices in without having folks needing to always unmute and speak up. And then maybe the last thing that comes to mind in this moment is I really try to be cognizant of if I see somebody unmute and then another participant speaks up and they remute themselves, I always try to see if they still want to speak up and take a step forward. Because if you've unmuted yourself and then the conversation gets away and you're just like, never mind, I want to make sure that I'm honoring the fact that you wanted to share and that you wanted to add in. I think that's an important part because it's a signal. They're sending you a signal that they'd like to add in. So those are a couple in there, but a lot of them just from a philosophical place is very similar to in person, is you just have to look for those places and ways to make sure that all voices can be heard and heard in a way that they feel comfortable sharing in.
Thank you, Stephen. And one more question. How do you troubleshoot, this is from Eleanor, how do you troubleshoot engagement issues? For example, asking a question and no one volunteers to answer.
Yeah. I'll pull one from the last answer as the starting point. Counting to 10 has always been a thing that I'll do in virtual or in person. If I ask a question and nobody's responding, typically, not always, but typically, I will get to about 8 in my mind. I'll count to 10, I'll get to 8 in my mind, and somebody will speak up, and just to get the ball rolling. So that's one that I mentioned that I think is also effective. I think in how you pace the engagement in your agenda is really important. Kind of to that point of, we'll do an audio check and we'll do a happies and crappies where we're hearing everybody's voice just to get comfortable and know that it's safe. I don't want to use the word safe. It is accepted and welcomed to speak up in a space that we're facilitating, and just to give an easing into that, I think is also really helpful. In a physical space, I would also segment the room just to make it less of a choice for folks to kind of like hide in the background. So I might say, hey, from this side of the room, I would love to hear your answer to this question. And so it's like those 5 or 6 people will look at each other and somebody will typically step forward and speak up, which also helps. So in a virtual space, it might be, especially now there's a Zoom update where you can order the boxes on the window and kind of make everybody see it that same way. You could do something similar in that way. And then if you're really not getting the engagement, you can always pause. And it's kind of meta. You pause and you go, not hearing a lot from this group, and I just want to check in and see how people are doing. And just because maybe there is stuff always going on beyond the room or the space that you're facilitating. So just checking in with people, because maybe it needs to be adjusted a little because there's other stuff, and that's okay too. It's part of it.
Well, no worries about no questions from this audience. This is a wonderfully engaged group, and I'm very appreciative of what you're sharing. I'm going to hit you with 3 questions really quick because they are tactical to things that you shared that they wanted to know more about. So first question, are you willing to let us post a copy of your slides to the website because your list of tools people wanted? That's going to be good? Okay, yeah. Fantastic. Then this will be in the on-demand resources in Open Classroom. Give us until tomorrow and we'll post it. When you mentioned posting a timer for breaks, people loved that. To me, that looked like you were Googling and screen sharing your browser. Was there anything else people need to know about what you're doing? It's just that. Okay, guys, pull it up on Google, share your screen. And then also your floor plan with the meetings represented visually. Were those separate Zoom links? Were they breakout? Speak just a little, if you would, about what you were visually organizing there.
Yeah, that was one of those experiences where I was like, I'm going to swing for the fences on this one, and we're going to see how it plays out. And it went pretty well. So to that point, this was before. So Zoom has put out an update where folks can self-select into breakout rooms, which would have changed probably how I would have designed that activity. So that happened before it. But each of those links, so all of those rooms, they were each individual Zoom meeting rooms. And between myself, staff at the organization I was working with, and another co-facilitator, each of us created a Zoom room ourselves And those became the links, because if I create too many Zoom rooms, and depending on the license, it can slow the whole thing down a lot if I have a bunch of Zoom meetings happening at once. So we just figured it'd be easier for all of us to create one, and that's how we created the links. And what's so nice about that too is if you click on the link in that mural board, you didn't have to leave the Zoom room you're already in. If you click that link, it would just say, do you want to move to this meeting room? And all I had to click was yes, and it would just shift you over. And so it was a pretty smooth experience. And I felt confident in its design. The staff I was working with at the organization were like, let's see how this works out. And even they were surprised at how quickly the group took to it. I mean, the simulation was challenging, and that was part of the point, is we wanted the group to really have some challenges. And there were some places I would do things differently, but they were different Zoom rooms, and it was really easy for people to move around. And it gave a lot of flexibility for movement in a virtual space.
And just to clarify, when you're saying different Zoom rooms, you're saying different Zoom meetings, different
Yes.
URLs. Okay.
I appreciate
it's not a technical specificity in Zoom. It's just different meetings.
Yeah, important.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stephen, Laura asks, she leads therapy groups in the evening after teens have been in Zoom all day for school. And I found open-ended questions don't land well in a virtual setting. Do you have any fun tips for working with youth to avoid further Zoom fatigue?
That is a real challenge. I have a couple thoughts off the top of my mind. I'm working on a project right now for a conference, a virtual conference. And one of the things that we've talked about is doing phone only sessions. That's not always the easiest, but it does allow people to walk around, move around. Sometimes just moving your body, if you're able, can really help. So we've been talking a lot about that, is not being on video, because sometimes that's part of Zoom fatigue, is you're just staring at a screen. And I've resorted to having my meetings sometimes just be phone meetings, even when it's offered as a Zoom meeting. It's like, I want to pace. I want to move around if I can. So that's one place that I think about. I'd say another spot is kind of something we did here, which was using a poll. So it's not necessarily that folks have to unmute and provide input or feedback, but if I can get a top level view of where people are at or how they're feeling, I can use that and say, all right, it looks like most of the group is feeling really fatigued from the day. Could somebody maybe talk a little bit more about that and start somewhere that's a little bit more, I don't want to say less challenging, but gives you as a facilitator some content to work off of, so that it's not waiting for the blank slate to get filled, but giving people a really easy way to put stuff out there. And I also think there's some cool, like Mentimeter is a good example. I think there's some really cool virtual tools that people can use to, play quick games or to submit really simple responses to get folks talking. But I also just, like, at the end of the day, if people are really fatigued by Zoom, that just might be the case. And maybe it is those breathing exercises like that example at the top, or playing that music. But if you've been on Zoom meetings from 9 to 5, it's hard to get away from. And maybe you ask them, maybe you just ask that question and name it. I know you're all fatigued by Zoom. Is there something that you would love to do right now? What would be good for you? What would feel good for you? And let them name it, give them the agency over that, and see if that helps as well.
Stephen, do you have any concrete physical visuals that you use with young people? That's a question from Joan.
I don't tend to use a lot of physical stuff. Although, Cynthia, I'm thinking about those signs that you showed us. Do you have those by chance anywhere nearby? Because I think those are a great example.
Yeah, let's see if I can make them. These are some that let's see if I can make it work. Email me. This one also says working on it. That works well with my young people. I love this one, inappropriate.
It's in a heart to it, which I really love.
And then remind them to say thank you and you're welcome. So yeah, I have about a dozen of those that I purchased, and they work well with my youth. Thanks for asking, Stephen.
Thanks for showing it. I think that's so cool. The only other place that I would add into that is I always have a notebook with me, or I also have a whiteboard notebook, which is like it's literally pages of whiteboard, which is pretty cool. And I'll just hold it up to the camera. That's something I miss about physical spaces. I'm a big whiteboard user, clearly with mural and all that. And so if I'm not using that with a group, I'll do things like that. Or even if activities, I'll ask folks in advance to bring blank paper and markers. And sometimes it's nicer just to physically draw stuff out and hold it up to the camera. Yeah, but I love Cynthia's. I feel like I need to get a set.
For people in the chat asking where you got them, Cynthia, so you might want to throw that in. And Stephen might want to know too.
Okay. I'll run away and go. I'll go get the box so I can tell them where to go.
Awesome. So Esther is wondering about breaks, your thoughts on when and for how long, and just speak to us about that, please.
Yeah. A lot of the spaces that I facilitate in can be either 60 minutes or 120. Oftentimes they're 2 hours. We will always take a break at that 2-hour mark. So 10 minutes before the 2-hour mark, constantly. That is a precedent. We try to set 10 minutes and give people time. I try not to do 5-minute breaks. I want to give people time to get coffee, let the dog out, check in with your family, loved ones, whatever you need to do to give people that space. Also, we'll work in breaks where you might not leave your computer, but those eye breaks and stretch breaks will be about 2 minutes. And we usually do those at the break is at a midpoint. Those breaks would be either at a midpoint of that first half or a midpoint of that second half. And I try to also tell people really explicitly when those are coming, because that way they can kind of plan out and know when it's going to occur. That way I don't want people to miss anything, but I try to normalize the fact that if you need to go to the restroom or step away, turn off your camera, please. Do what you have to do. I know that in a space that I'm facilitating, I will always try my best to know that my participants want to be there. And if they're not, it's for a good reason, like something going on around them. So being really explicit when those breaks are, putting them in at regular intervals, telling people when they are, and then also normalizing that it's okay to turn off your video. And I'll name too that I work predominantly with adult population. So that might be different with other groups, but for those folks that I work with, that tends to work really well. And I just, if breaks aren't always top of mind, I would challenge folks to really think about them, because I think that can be, for those with Zoom fatigue, can be huge refreshers for people. Huge refreshers.
Agreed. So question from Atia. What is your thought about, yeah, we love Atia. What's your thought about side chats? Like even when side conversations going on while there's a presentation, even if it's productive, somewhat on topic, what thoughts do you have about that?
Talk about that all day. That almost made it list of the tips, but I felt really specific. And so I'm really glad that that question got brought up. Chats can be challenging. I like them. I think people would, in a perfect world, I would love people to have back channel chat at a conference or something. I want people to engage and to talk. And when chat's happening as a facilitator, I try not to pay attention to it, but I'll go to it and I'll try to lift up pieces or elements from it. So let's say somebody shared a comment or a view. I might say, hey, I'd love to lift up this comment, and I might read it out and then offer up a chance for that person to speak to it more if they want to. I don't want to put them on the spot, so if they don't, that's okay. But some of the best relationship stuff has happened in the chat. A lot of support, a lot of affirmations happen in the chat, and I don't want to stymie that. So I let that be, and then I'll check into it and I'll name that. So it's kind of like that choreography point of, all right, everybody, I'm going to take a quick look at the chat, see if there's anything that we want to lift up. And so they know that I'm not just pausing and reading quietly. They know what I'm doing, and I try to pull those pieces out from time to time. And then at the same time, I'll try to go back through a chat, and if there's links to articles, funny videos, any of that, I'll try to capture it and include it in a recap email. So it becomes this kind of living, breathing record of what's going on. But I really love the chat. I think there's fun stuff, because then I get to laugh too, because sometimes there's jokes about a thing that happened and I get to chuckle and be a part of it, which is really fun. I tend to encourage it. I really like a chat, but you got to honor it. You can't just let it be there. You have to kind of name it and pay attention to it from time to time throughout.
So a question about green screens. So I know you have you have an opinion about this. Erica's noting that they can be expensive, but I think you found a solution you like that was not expensive. What would you share?
Yeah, if and I can find this link and pull it. There was a couple articles. One was from the New York Times, and I don't remember what the other places were, but I have them linked or bookmarked. Were reporters and journalists who were like, here's how I built my home studio. And they were giving really good recommendations. So this green screen, which I will show you, there's the AC unit behind it and the rest of the basement. This one is, I think, somewhere in the $12 to $15 range, and it's just big enough. And what I did is I bought clip magnets, and the AC duct is running behind me. And so I clip magneted it up behind there. And on this corner, it's actually clip magneted to a sleeve of a winter coat to keep it kind of like together. And then I have a light over here. It's a desk light that's LED, and it was, I think, 20 bucks. So I really tried to go as budget as I could. I would say, if you can, I probably the best bet, honestly, is pricing wise Amazon. There's some really good options, and we're past a point where there was some pretty bad price gouging on virtual tools. So I would check that. Look for a $12 to $15 purchase because they're out there for sure.
Stephen, I'm back on screen because people like me with curly hair, my friend Atia, also who was in the chat, we have an issue with our hair disappearing. So you and I talked earlier about that situation, and I just want to know if you have any solutions in case some other curly girls or curly guys have the same question.
Yeah. So the green screen, I think, is going to be the biggest way to fix it. And then the other would be not using virtual backgrounds, because I think the way that Zoom works is it's going to try its best, but it's not, it's not production broadcast level kind of quality work on that. There are some newer tools that are coming out that I think do a really good job. You can connect into Zoom, but it is challenging. And I think that Zoom backgrounds they're not equitable in their experience. So being really careful and cautious about that with folks, I think, is important, because I've been in plenty of spaces kind of like you're talking about, where all of a sudden a half of you is completely missing in a Zoom window, which isn't good. But the most straightforward answer I can give is the green screen, because it does make a clear distinction between you, the subject, and the background, and it creates that crisper, kind of like what's going on here, crisper piece, and so you don't get the halo effect as much, because that can be a challenge and a problem.
Last question from me. I have been told that a green screen is not always green. It could be white. It could be other colors. What actual color is your green screen?
Let's see if this is going to be jarring for folks. I'll turn off the virtual background.
Okay.
Ah.
It's green. Okay. And it's cloth?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Pretty lightweight too. Let me see if I can grab one of these clips. Ooh, there we go. So this was a pack of the magnet clips that I use on them. And that too is like a pack of 20 for, I think, $5 or $6. So it's really lightweight fabric, which is nice. The other color that tends to get used a lot is blue, but Zoom is kind of preordained that green is going to be the one they stick to. So I would look for a green screen if that's a thing for you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This has been so much fun, and there has been so much wonderful feedback for you and gratitude of you sharing your lessons learned from the audience. I knew this time was going to go quick, and it really has. We're approaching the hour. Before I send us out, do you have any final thought you want to share with the group?
Yeah, it makes me think about what you and I were talking about at the top, Janet, of everybody's figuring it out, and to give grace to participants, to give grace to yourself, that virtual spaces can be new for a lot of folks. And for those of you, obviously the folks who are on this, who are doing this work, thank you. You do a lot of really critical, crucial, important things. And to keep pushing forward. If it's challenging, if it's tough, and it's hard, and it really is for everybody, your work is important, and keep figuring out how to do this well. Keep figuring out how to do this well for your participants, that their experience is the most important part, and keep them centered in this, because a facilitator's job is for them and with them as a conduit.
Very well said. And I am stalling because I'm not as ready as I wanted to be. I realized that just this morning we published a link for a workshop that Stephen is doing in March. We've got people saying, I want to join your class. And I'm like, oh, wait, you can. So I'm going to give you guys this link. Stephen is going to be doing a 3-hour workshop on facilitating better virtually. It will be done as a Zoom webinar. It is a fee for service thing. It's $60 general admission, but well worth it. And if wherever you are in the country or the world, we would love to have you join us. So with that, we're at time. Stephen, thank you so much. Cynthia, as always, wonderful to host with you. And please stay healthy and safe out there, everybody. Hope to see you again soon.
Bye.
Everybody.